You're effectively like a lame duck waiting to be shot at by hackers.
Welcome to Crash, the technology podcast about everything else. Today, that means the inexorable rise of the surveillance state, the inexorable struggle of those trying to stop the rise of the surveillance state, and the inexorable rise of the use of the word inexorable. I'm Alex Hudson.
And I'm Chris Stokel-Walker. What does inexorable actually mean? It's one of those words that I use, but I couldn't give you a definition in a line of it.
Unstoppable. It's inevitable. It is certain. It cannot be stopped. It's sort of a rolling stone. It will never stop. It is impossible. You can't fix it. How are you? Have you grown a moustache to fool the Online Safety Act yet?
I haven't. I can't grow a moustache. I'm one of those people who I have like bitty facial hair, but it would not grow into a full moustache. I can imagine you're a hirsute man when it comes to the facial stuff, Alex. Or am I incorrect in that?
I could grow a moustache. I could not grow a full beard, but also then I'd be in East London, working in the media industry with a moustache, and I have as yet avoided the resurgence of the moustache. I understand why it's happened, but I'm not happy about it.
Do you partake in Movember? Good cause.
I can't be mean about Movember because it's such a beautiful, important charity. It does important, great work. It's a really beautiful marketing tool. All of it is wonderful. It's just irritating that specifically men need an excuse to do something interesting. I forget where I heard this, but this isn't my idea before I plagiarized it, but the idea that every man really likes to dress up, and that's why fancy dress parties are so popular, because it gives men an excuse and a reason to dress up all ridiculous and there'd be no consequences. So actually, Movember gives people an excuse to grow a moustache, even if they wanted to. Once again, very good reasons, really important charity, great work, but it gives them an excuse to do something a bit silly because they're so worried about being different, being unusual, wearing something ridiculous, having a nice time, wearing face paint, wearing makeup, whatever that is. And that feels depressing in a way.
I never thought of facial hair as being natural dressing up. That's never been in my mind. That perception of it has never been. Cavemen, it was their attempt to kind of go on a stag do in Newcastle on a Friday night. So before we get on to the first part, because Alex didn't actually explain the story, Alex, do you want to explain why we are talking about moustaches? Good job that one of us is on the ball today.
Yeah, well, I did warn you that today I'm particular chaos. I spent an hour in the Apple store while my camera doesn't work, the mic doesn't work, nothing works. And so this very nice man spent an hour working with me to be like, yeah, just turn it off and on again. And then, no, I have to rebuild the whole Mac now because it turns out that even genius bar experts don't know how to fix a Mac, which is infuriating. Then I feel like the Apple store instantly makes you more stupid. You walk in there and you are instantly irritated because the weird cattling system of, no, you're 5 minutes early. You need to stand here for 5 minutes for reasons that make no sense. You can't go upstairs yet. That would be confusing. And then you go upstairs and it is just infinite white men by themselves on their phone. In fact, around the table, universally, it was just people who'd stuck shit into their AirPods charger. So it was just a person coming over saying, give me a minute, and then coming back about, yeah, I just took the bit of nut or whatever it was out of your charger. It's like, can I just do that myself? You can, but we'd recommend coming back to the store to have someone fiddle with your charging port.
But we'd pay good money for that.
Good. This is just going to be chaos.
Spoiled.
But yeah. So because I am chaos, we started with moustaches and we haven't even talked about why it's moustaches. So with the stronger age checks under the Online Safety Act, essentially you have to do that weird photo thing that I still haven't done yet because VPNs. To prove that you're over a certain age if you're doing certain things online. And so 46% of children said that age checks were easy to bypass. 17% said they were difficult to fool. And actually, with the selfie surveillance systems, a kid has just drawn on a moustache and got round it. So they proved that they showed that they were 15, even though they were very, very much younger than 15. And so I love that level of deception requires just a little bit of a Sharpie on the face. And I think that is exactly where we are in the sort of technological world we exist in. Before we move on to the main bit of the serious surveillance state, I just wanted to react a little bit to the level of virality of Sainsbury's chat and our Uber Eats chat, which, you know, customer service warrior as we are you as surprised as I am that our audience, at least on TikTok specifically, was really, well, it's not our audience, the people on TikTok.
We do not
So,
own them. They just come
we
and
do
then
not
they
own them.
go.
We're actually like, yeah, this is fine. I'm fine with Sainsbury's surveilling me. I'm fine with facial recognition. And I think a lot of people mistook those camera checkout things of just you're being CCTV'd for actual facial recognition. So I think that's a lot of confusion still exists there. But are you surprised by just the sort of nonplusness of facial recognition within supermarkets?
I don't know. I think there is a generational gap between this sort of stuff where you and I really care passionately about it. And because elements of that have been baked into how you transact your digital lives anyway. So we had an age where we could be anonymous as kids. I think it's kind of that idea of, well, everything else of mine is already on the internet. Everything else of mine is already likely to be hacked because, just that's the way that the world is these days. And if I want to buy some food or get discounts on my shopping, or I want to enter into a place of work or whatever, that I have to have my photo taken and that has to be stored on a database somewhere. There's a kind of futility to it. I suppose people are just kind of worn down a little bit by this.
You have an entire episode of the futility of anonymity, so we should probably move on to our main story. Facial recognition apps allowing police officers to do identity checks instantly with their phones are being adopted by police forces before a potential national rollout. Conversations around body cam footage being part of this have happened, reports suggest, and facial recognition, as we've talked about before, is rolling out all over the place, including in supermarkets, as we talked about in Crash last week. So a lot of discussion happened after the show about Sainsbury's using facial recognition, but actually they're not the only ones doing it. So Southern Co-op, Asda, Iceland, Food Warehouse and Sainsbury's themselves have all discussed either trialling or launching facial recognition in stores. There are some more, but lawyers have advised us not to mention those names. But this comes at a time when the watchdogs are warning that the oversight of AI-powered face scanning is lagging behind, with England and Wales' biometrics commissioner saying the cart has gone before the horse. So a report by The Guardian said a whistleblower claimed shop-based face scanning systems had sometimes been misused by shop or security staff maliciously. So essentially just added members of the public to watch list simply after not liking the cut off their jib. Mark Wilding is an investigative journalist for Liberty Investigates. He reports on the machinery underneath modern Britain, so surveillance systems, policing, tech, borders, databases, procurement, and back-end state power. It's wild that we haven't talked to him before on Crashed because he's interested in exactly what we're interested in, the sort of infrastructure behind power and the tech industry shaping how that works and where the power moves and the power shifts. And when I asked an LLM to sum him up, it said his reporting feels like somebody trying to map the operating system of the modern state before most people realise it's there, which is a rounding endorsement from the machine. Mark, welcome to Crash. How are you doing?
I'm very well. Thanks, Alex. Thanks for having me.
The reason we're really excited to talk to you is you've just completed an investigation into the level of police usage of facial recognition technology and how little regulation there is. Could you explain a little bit about it?
Yeah, so the latest story is about handheld facial recognition. So it's important to remember that there are lots of different types of facial recognition. I mean, 3 core ones being used by the police, and people are probably most familiar with the cameras they see on the street mounted on top of a van, so scanning the faces of passers-by. But the police also use it in other ways. They use it to run CCTV footage or social media images, like through a facial recognition database after the fact. And my story was about what is often referred to as operator-initiated or officer-initiated facial recognition. Essentially, it's an app on a mobile phone that allows a police officer to scan someone's face in the street and conduct an instant identity check. And so my story was about the number of forces that are exploring this technology, either issuing it to officers or considering doing that. And that comes against the backdrop of there being no specific legislation governing police use of facial recognition in this country.
That's the question of, is it legal? Is it a grey area? Or is it just waiting for someone to come and actually build a law around it or banning it?
Well, I mean, it's questionable, right? So the government and police forces will say, well, there are loads of laws governing facial recognition. And in a sense, that is true, right? You know, there's data protection law, there's equalities law that governs everything they do. But as I say, there is no specific legislation governing facial recognition. And people who are concerned about this argue that this is a really transformative technology. It could affect all of us. And so there is a strong argument that we should have specific legislation governing facial recognition rather than relying on like this patchwork of a bit here and a bit there.
We've had facial recognition for a long time. So why do you think that we haven't had that legislation, Mark? What is it that is stopping the government from doing this? Is it that they just don't want the hassle of having to have that conversation about what's actually going on?
You're right. Facial recognition has obviously been around for a long time. You will know that for many years it was rubbish. So that was part of the issue. I think the police have had access to facial recognition searches through the Police National Database since 2014, I'm going to say. And for many years, they just hardly used it because it was no use. And then they changed the algorithm in, I think it was end of 2019. And then I did a story previously about how use just suddenly rocketed. It was over fourfold in the course of a year. So that's one thing, is that the technology is getting better. It's becoming more useful to the police. But there's also been a push by ministers. So the previous Home Secretary, Chris Philp, was a big proponent of facial recognition, was pushing it. The Labour government has pushed it as well. I think it's frankly, an easy way to appear tough on crime, which lots of people are concerned about. So an easy win in a way, like this technology's there, we'll adopt it and show that we're being tough on crime. And at the same time, legislation, it takes time. It hasn't been a priority for either the previous government or this one by the looks of things.
But what happens when there's that mismatch between this being rolled out more and more and there not being this kind of legislative oversight?
Well, one of the key questions is why successive governments have really pushed this technology while at the same time not matching that with legislation to guard against some of the more concerning or harmful implications of it being used.
This is part of the malaise around it then, because and Jamie Bartlett's got that book out around like AI is reshaping the world and no one seems to care. And it feels almost that way with facial recognition. Like we're going a little bit viral this week around our Sainsbury's chat around the use of their facial recognition in stores. And I assumed everyone would be appalled by it, and everyone would be like, "Well, I don't feel like my face should be tracked by a supermarket." And yet, it was really 50-50 split around the balance of actually this is kind of fine. A sort of old adage of nothing to hide, so it's obviously okay that my face is being tracked, or we just don't shop there. And it feels like the government is getting away with beta testing surveillance policy in public. That feels like a massive problem to me. Or do you think that that's actually part of its design?
I think there's a few different things going on here that explain why people are not as engaged or concerned about this issue as they might otherwise be. One is that facial recognition is normalized in a way, because most of us use facial recognition numerous times a day when we unlock our phone, right? And that seems like a really helpful thing in most of our lives. Well, that's an example of a one-to-one facial recognition algorithm. Your phone is checking whether you are the person who owns the phone. That's really helpful. The police are using what is a one-to-many facial recognition search. So they are searching your face against thousands, sometimes millions of faces to see if there's a match. And the implications are totally different. The term facial recognition, this idea has been normalized, and it kind of makes people comfortable with a lot of different kinds of uses.
Yes. So map out then, Mark, because obviously as we've heard from Alex there, 50% of our audience think that actually no big deal. But you're saying that one-to-many checking is a big deal, and that's part of the cornerstone of what Liberty talks about. So why is that such a big concern? What are the kind of ways that this spools out into our lives?
Yeah, and there's a few different concerning elements of it. One is perhaps slightly abstract, is this notion of like the relationship that we all have with the police, with the state. In this country, we are not required at the moment to carry ID cards to produce ID upon request, but facial recognition is, well, exactly. But, at the moment, that is not the case. And yet facial recognition subjects you to an identity check, whether that data, whether the footage is being stored or not. You go into public, your identity is checked against a database to see whether you should be stopped or not. So it changes the relationship you have with the authorities. The other thing is bias, racial and gender discrimination. The technology, as we discussed, has got better over the years, but we are consistently told that the way it's being used at the moment does not indicate racial or gender bias. And then I've written stories where it has turned out that actually a system that's being used does exhibit that. Not only that the police lobbied to use it at the settings where it was racially discriminatory, because they wanted to get more matches than they did if it was used at unbiased settings. There's an issue about whether this is actually a effective way of doing policing. I asked police forces whether they had made any assessment of how cost effective this is compared to traditional policing methods, and almost all of them said they hadn't done that exercise. Well, that seems like a really crucial thing to be doing if we're going to change the nature of policing and invest all this money in it, and tell the public that we're going to make this sort of big change to the way policing is carried out if we don't even know it's effective.
It seems also that, you know, facial recognition, those bans that go around, we've seen a lot of ballyhoo around that from the government. Yet your investigation was the first time that I heard about these handheld devices being used. What does that tell us about, you know, either confidence in them or why it's being kind of done on the quiet? You literally use quietly, I think, in the report that you did on how this is being rolled out.
Yeah, I mean, I think transparency is a big issue about it, right? Like, there are many different ways in which facial recognition can be used. You can, like, as we have discussed, you can park a van in the street and scan the faces of passerby. You can issue an app on a phone to officers. And people may have different views about those two different things. So I think it's unhelpful to just talk about facial recognition in, like, generalities. That is one thing. And why are police forces being left to experiment with different kinds of uses? You know, I heard from one police force that they were running composite images, so like photo fits through facial recognition searches. And I spoke to one of the academics who invented this system, and he said, yeah, that's going on. I mean, it doesn't work. But so the level of experimentation that is being allowed to happen at the same time as there being no laws governing what is done, I think is a concern.
How does composite image specifically, surely the legal consequences of that when someone is, I would assume, very easily mismatched, is there legal recourse for that, for those wrong false positives, or is actually the legal system, as we've just seen in the most recent case, that took months and months and months to get through? Are they getting away with it scot-free to try to experiment these things, or are charities and organizations like yours really pushing them to be better?
Well, it's really difficult to know how many people are being affected by this, right? Because you will know if you pass a facial recognition camera in the street and you are stopped and you are not the person they are looking for. But the technology that is in much far wider use is the form where CCTV or social media images are run through a database. And if you get a knock on the door from police officers who have connected you to a crime, you're not necessarily going to know that was why you were flagged as a person of interest. So I found a case involving a lad named Alvi Chowdhury, 26-year-old software engineer from Southampton. And he was flagged by a facial recognition match to a burglary that took place in Milton Keynes. He'd never been to Milton Keynes, and yet he spent 10 hours in a police cell, because if the algorithm says you're the person, it's very difficult to convince a police officer otherwise. As it happened, he actually said that when he was interviewed, they looked at the image from the CCTV camera and started laughing because it was obvious to them that he wasn't the person they were looking for. But that was 10 hours later.
But this is the sort of toxic combination of things, right? It's that supremacy and belief that AI and the computer will always be right, and the fact that there's no guardrails around this, and the fact that you were talking about that composite use, horrifying, because effectively what you've got is rank and file police officers saying, have a toy and play with it and see what happens.
I think you could say that. And, in terms of guardrails, what the police will frequently say and are on record saying about the fact that there is known bias in the main system used nationally for retrospective searches is that, well, there's always a human in the loop, is how they describe it. This is only ever an intelligence lead. Well, in Alvy's case, there was absolutely no other investigative work done. And we know about algorithmic bias. If the machine says something, it's much more of a leap to challenge that decision than just to follow it through and see if the lead goes anywhere. So I think there must be more cases out there where like people like Alvy have experienced this, and they maybe don't even know.
And so on that, then, for our listeners who are maybe wondering if they have been used by this, where is this OIFR, this kind of officer-initiated facial recognition taking place?
So South Wales Police was one of the first to embrace it. I think they are the first force who has said, we're going to roll this out on a permanent basis. They did a pilot a few years ago and have decided to adopt it permanently. The Met Police in London have said, I don't think they've started their trial just yet, but they've said they are going to be trialling this as well. We know West Midlands is using it. They're doing something slightly different at the moment, where they are taking body-worn camera footage and then sending that back to be checked against a database by another operator. So that's slightly different from the app, but they're calling that OIFR. Thames Valley also exploring it. So a few different places. And we know the Home Office is exploring making this available to police forces across the country. So I think isolated cases now, but we can see the direction that this is going.
Once the Home Office gets involved, is that when it gets that political scrutiny? Are you expecting that is the moment, if there is that national rollout, that there will be that oversight and there will have to be that debate and there will have to be that policy through Westminster? Or are you even more pessimistic that actually they're still going to continue just assuming everything's fine?
I mean, look, the Home Office has been pushing this for a long time, so I don't think that that's particularly connected. But the department did run a consultation from December to February on new laws governing facial recognition use by the police. They published the consultation and made it quite clear that the idea was to enable the police to use it more and more often. So I don't think we're expecting to see any laws that are really clamping down on the circumstances in which this can be used. But that consultation's closed. We're waiting to see what the responses were, what the response of the government is. So we're told there will be some legislation, but it seems unlikely that it is going to limit the police use of this in any serious way.
Is there a way that this could be used right? Is there a place for facial recognition in policing, do you think?
I think everyone's going to have different views on that. And I think, as I said before, some people are going to be more comfortable with the idea of a photo taken from a crime scene being run through a database to look for matches, given appropriate safeguards. People might have different views on when that is proportionate, depending on the type of crime being investigated. For example, people might feel very differently about, a parking violation compared to murder. It's all about assessing the context, I think. And I think most people, whether you're in favour at the moment or not, would feel a lot more comfortable knowing that there are laws that set out quite clearly what the circumstances are and when this is appropriate, and what safeguards are in place to make sure it's not biased, there's not overreach, that there's appropriate scrutiny and all of those kinds of things.
So moving on more broadly around the sort of, not the end game, because there is no such thing, but where we are heading towards, it feels like the police are never going to be the most up to date technologically. So they're probably working on tech that is maybe at best a couple of years. They're not right at the vanguard of what the sort of stuff that's being done at the moment. So can you see a roadmap where the surveillance capability is about to jump because of all manner of different processing power, all manner of AI, where actually the police might even stop for a second and say that's too much? Or is there that technological revolution coming where more of this will be capable and it will have fewer and fewer human safeguards in place?
I may well be overlooking something, but I think there are probably very few examples of the police looking at a technology that could be used to investigate crime and say, well, that seems a bit much. I think it's the job of others to point out the potential pitfalls in doing that, and that's part of the negotiation that takes place. I think what AI enables, right, is firstly technologies like facial recognition, but it also allows the police or anyone to do things with this vast amount of data that is being collected that they weren't able to do before, to make connections, to identify patterns. People have become very used to the idea that the UK is one of the most heavily surveilled countries in the world through the CCTV network. That was before AI enabled the technology that means that one face could be tracked across that CCTV network, and you could You upload one person's photo and you can see everywhere they've been, create their daily pattern, identify where they deviate from that behavior that seems suspicious. So I think it's enabling new uses of the existing surveillance infrastructure that are concerning.
And then does that mean that then anonymity becomes inherently suspicious? So if you've chosen to VPN your way around surveillance, if you've chosen to hide, well, as much as you can hide from being videoed all over the place, if you're making as many choices as you can, the whole tin hat wearing people that really want to avoid detection or using sort of closed systems, already you're seeing that being a sort of either you're willfully withdrawing yourself from society or you're facing immense hurdles to be able to do that. And I've heard anecdotally of many people at risk of suspicion just because they are trying to avoid the sort of standard business as usual way of tracking through email, through all of these different things. Could you see a time when, or is it maybe we're already in that time when trying to be anonymous is inherently suspicious?
Well, I mean, one obvious way in which this could play out, right, is if you are uncomfortable with the idea of being scanned by a facial recognition camera for any particular reason, and you decide to hide your face when you walk past the van. And that should not be grounds for suspicion to be stopped by an officer in question. But, you can look up videos on YouTube that show exactly that happening. So, yeah, clearly people taking steps to preserve their anonymity for whatever reason it may be runs the risk of actually attracting suspicion. The old adage is, nothing to hide, nothing to fear. But, I think there are all kinds of problems with that statement. But one of them is with the sheer amount of data that is out there that we have all left, the traces of our digital selves we've left everywhere, that can now be connected up. And stories can be created from that, with enough data, you can create any kind of story that you want to. And I think that's a concern. And that's reason enough why people might want to preserve their privacy. And as you say, there is a risk that is sort of seen as evidence of wrongdoing in itself.
How much does AI add into this equation? The idea that you can make those linkages that you talked about. This was a concern in the pre-AI obsessed era and something that Liberties was campaigning about for a long, long time. But have the stakes been risen by this, to use a horrible passive way of asking that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think it just enables the kinds of thing, the sort of dystopian scenarios that we were worried about but thought were outlandish a few years ago. I'm not sure if it's the most recent one. I remember watching one of the Mission Impossible films, which played out heavily on facial recognition. And previously you'd watch those films and think, that's a cool film, but that's incredibly implausible. And I sat there watching it this time just thinking, okay, yeah, that can happen. And it's quite scary stuff. And AI is a sort of enabling, the pattern recognition capabilities of AI are unlocking all kinds of possibilities that we would have thought were crazy just a few years ago.
For this point, we should probably say that we have spoken to the Met and we have spoken to the company behind Sainsbury's for comment. Nothing has come back as yet. And we've gone over 20 minutes of talking without mentioning Orwell once, which I think is probably, thank goodness, great. But like when it comes to that Mission Impossible film that you're talking about and all of the Orwell work and so much of the sci-fi dystopian hellscape has facial recognition, it has everyone being tracked, has this surveillance state as a real key warning in all of those things. And yet we haven't learned. We are not acting. We've been given all of these like headline warnings about what is coming. And now, as you say, what was maybe 10, 15 years ago unreasonable or unrealistic, or that's still sci-fi in the future, is now happening. I still don't understand, given the warnings that society have been given about the consequences of what could happen in this state, why still we're looking at those films or looking at the surveillance and being like, this is fine. Why are we not listening to Hollywood being like, come on, listen, help? Why do we not care more?
I think we've all become very used to the idea of the loss of privacy in a way. I mean, it's a kind of a cliche thing to say in some ways, but many of us have spent a large part of the last few years posting like all kinds of information online proactively. I think we were all doing that. Reminded of the early days of Facebook, where you would just upload a batch of 50 photos from like every night out you went on. And then we all realized actually maybe we're not comfortable with that level of information being online. I think a similar shift is about to happen, where people realize the information that is available out there can be connected in new ways that are problematic in a way that they were not before. So I think things have changed so quickly that maybe we're still catching up with that new reality. Maybe it's a case of a lot of that, those fictional scenarios have kind of normalized it in a way. Things like 1984, I think it's an incredibly dystopian vision of the future, right? But to warn that kind of thing is possible does make you sound a little bit crazy. But that could be where the elements of that story could be part of the near future.
There's a scale thing as well, right? It feels like it's just happening constantly from all different quarters, and so you get ground down. I guess that's why it's even more important that we have reporting like yours and the campaigning from Liberty to actually remind us this stuff is worth fighting for.
I think there's only so many things that you can worry about, right? And there's a lot of things to choose from at the moment. So yeah, I focus, at Liberty Investigates, I focus on state surveillance, and that's just one of many things people could choose to be worried about these days. But I would suggest that it's something worth keeping an eye on.
As a final question, is if our listeners are concerned about this sort of thing, as without meaning to lead the witness, they should be. What would be your advice as far as limiting exposure or making sure that they are being aware of the sorts of risks and how they can mitigate those?
It's difficult because we've all been living our lives in a world where these kind of systems were not around, right? So, the images that we post on social media have probably already been harvested by, if not the state, then by private companies to populate their facial recognition products. But if you're really concerned about it, I'd be mindful of the kind of stuff that you post online that may be harvested by companies producing these kind of products and then selling them into state agencies. So that's one thing. And the other thing I think is just to try and prompt some of that debate about these technologies that hasn't been happening yet. The usual kinds of things, like write to your MP, let them know that you are concerned about it, because MPs have a lot of issues to choose from, to worry about as well. And I think this perhaps deserves to be further up the agenda than it has been.
And where can people find your work? Where can people find you? Where can people get in touch if they want to find out more or read the story?
So Liberty Investigates partners with different news organisations to put our work out there, but we collect it all at libertyinvestigates.org.uk. And for reasons discussed, I don't have a huge online presence, but people can find me on LinkedIn if they would like to do that.
Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been really interesting.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Chris. Really appreciate it.
Welcome back to the second part of Crashed. The government says it intends to create a national digital ID system for the UK. So the consultation opened in March and it's just closed. So the system is being framed around three principles. It sounds very government. It must be useful, inclusive and trusted, but it boils down to a digital ID connected to the gov.uk app and essentially a single login and a single universal digital identity. And it operates in a reusable way across the entire digital sphere. So ID cards, I hear you say, and self-sovereign identity. I read your emails already. And ever since Tony Blair's Identity Cards Act 2006 tried to introduce natural biometric ID cards for security, immigration control and public service access, it's been doing the rounds. Policymakers have been doing a little dance of 2 steps forward, 2 steps back, 1 step left, 1 step right, using different words to try and make anyone think this is a good idea. But it's been a slow, really slow passage of mapping digital ID onto something that the electorate will actually tolerate. So this scheme is being described very loudly as being voluntary, but, and there's a lot of buts, critics say that if digital right-to-work checks become mandatory by the end of this Parliament, as the government has promised, then what does voluntary mean? The government says It should help people prove who they are, access public services more easily, reduce bureaucracy, and provide a trusted identity layer across public services and parts of the economy. And as Meta, Alphabet, TikTok, and others have shown, the value of identity and information is huge, and that, in the hands of the government, of any government, is what so many apocalyptic science fiction is all about. Chris, what is this actually about? Is it just Tony Blair reincarnated? And what does this consultancy actually mean in practice?
Yeah, gosh, I mean, yeah, it's the resuscitation of the Tony Blair idea, and then the Tony Blair Institute's version of that idea souped up for the modern day. I mean, I find it more alarming in the sense of it just feels like it's going to be more admin. So the consultation seems to say that this is separate to or building on top of the already in place one login system that you have to use if you want to try and get into any sort of government service. So if you're filing your taxes or whatever, then you have like a username and a password that you log into there. It sounds like when you use this digital ID, you'll get something that sits in a wallet, which I'm guessing will be like maybe alongside your Oyster cards or your credit cards or whatever on your phone. But like, it just feels to me like it's more complicated than it needs to be, and you'll end up with holding different accounts and different passwords for each of these things in a way that I'm not convinced it's going to be easier, particularly for the average person, right? Because I mean, like, I already find accessing the gov.uk website when I need to log into stuff just inexorably, to use our word, inexorably difficult, and inexorably toiling in a way that I don't want it to be.
I don't think that's true. I think the Gov.uk site works absolutely perfectly until you need to do something with a short deadline, and then only then does it decide that no, your login needs to be changed. Anytime you do self-assessment, so no, sorry, the government actually last filing deadline apologised because the site just broke on the deadline day. The Gov.uk won the website design. It's meant to make sense, and this feels like in most pure terms feels like a very beautiful, lovely extension of it. But otherwise, as we talked about in section 1, this feels like an expansion of the surveillance state. Or am I being too fearmongery around it?
Well, I just don't know whether or not it's necessary. I mean, it's not clear to me what exactly this will be layered into in terms of what services you'll need to access that this will be useful for.
So if they do it in the way that was prescribed, not by Blair did a slightly different version of it. So the principle of self-sovereign identity, where you own all of your data and you can have every single line of every single bit of your data free to give or keep from whoever you wish to. So if you are attending a club in London, which you have to give up in so many, you have to give over your driving license. They scan the whole thing, and so they have a literal record of everyone who has set foot in that in case anything kicks off, which is a whole different facial recognition problem. But with self-sovereign identity, the only thing that you would, well, depending on the club, but you would go in and you would hand over this thing, and the only thing they will be able to see is that you are old enough to be in there, or that that you have no criminal record, or whatever their stipulations are. And so that could be true if in the Gov.uk thing, that could be you only need to know this amount of data, and they wouldn't be able to see your photo, they wouldn't be able to see your face, there wouldn't be all of those ID checks. In reality, I would be amazed if that was actually what they were going to get to.
Yeah, because for one thing, the computer will break at that nightclub that you want to go into, or you'll have someone who says you kind of gave it away in your description. You said they'll check for your age, or maybe they might check. A different service might check for the fact of whether or not you have a criminal record. Like, it's very easy to imagine with these sorts of things that actually what is meant to be just an age check, are you over 18 or not, to be able to get access to this club, turns into, are you actually, a criminal? Do you have some sort of criminal history? Are you from a town that I don't like? And, not to denigrate bouncers, they are the great and the good of the world, but like, some bouncers will go, I don't want to let anybody in called Alex today. And that causes a big issue. The thing that I find really interesting about this whole project actually is, and this is my nerdy side coming out, is that they're running a part of this consultation using a people's panel on digital ID. Did you see this one, Alex?
I have not, but I'm writing a very, very long paper around focus groups and people's panels and just the absolute nonsense of performative inclusion around this sort of stuff.
So the people's panel is supposedly going to be a representative sample of 100 to 120 people who will get in, I guess, what's a focus group in terms of political polling. If you want to learn more about kind of polling and all that sort of stuff, we have an episode a couple of weeks ago that is worth listening to. Long-term listeners will, of course, already do that. And if you are one of those, then jolly well done on that. But if you're not, make sure you listen back. Yeah, welcome and listen back.
Subscribe.
We're not a cult. We're a little bit culty, but, some people might also pronounce it a different way, but that's all right. One of the things that I find really interesting about this is that 120 people is supposedly going to be selected through sortition. It's an episode of words today, inexorable and also sortition, which they
I don't know what sortition means.
Well, they helpfully define it for people like you and me, Alex, who don't know what sortition is, in that webpage that they're announcing it. Open brackets, civic lottery, close brackets. So it sounds to me like you're going to get a kind of jury duty style letter arriving in your post box one day, 100 to 120 of us saying, do you want to be part of this panel on digital ID? And I just wonder, how is that really the best way to be deciding on something quite as consequential as a digital ID process, that you have 100 to 120 random people selected through just a lottery process whose views will be canvassed in a more in-depth way? I don't know. I mean, the sort of process that we talked about in terms of getting a statistically relevant sample suggests that I don't know if you can get 120 people to represent sort of 70 million, although maybe I'm wrong on that. My polling data is out of date.
Depends who you speak to. They will say they can. I'm going to make the case using a paraphrase of Darren Jones for the digital ID card. So Darren Jones, Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister, he has spoken in Parliament. So it is as a fix for the miserable lived experience of dealing with the state. Call centres, paperwork, repeating your story, not knowing where your case is. He argues that because online banking works better than government admin, which is a low bar, it will actually, that identity layer will help the government in being more efficient. You will feel like you're being served better and it will be much quicker. Does that convince you that this is going to be great?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that I think Darren Jones's foreword to this report says. Currently, it's too hard to get what you need from the government when you need it. And as someone who is trying to sort out issues of problematic parking near where I live, I completely understand that. Actually, the idea that a local government officer couldn't talk to me because of purdah about a parking problem, I found just ridiculous these days.
Have you told him that purdah doesn't exist?
Well, no, I told him that he couldn't do his job very well in a separate way. Shouldn't go around abusing council staff, and I didn't. I just kind of forcefully made the point that he didn't know what he was talking about anyway.
It is now the pre-election period of sensitivity. I assumed it was called purdah still because I was out of date, and I'm now resharing that. I'm not gatekeeping the fact that our old name is now gets you in trouble in very specific Westminster circles for not being up to date on the exact language.
Why? What is the difference between purdah and pre-elections period of sensitivity?
So they are basically the same thing, but pre-election period of sensitivity is the better official wording. Purdah is old shorthand and increasingly avoided. It is still widely understood in politics, Whitehall, councils and journalism, but it's dated and many bodies avoid it because of its origins. Hold on, what were its origins?
Yeah, what? I'm becoming more and more intrigued by going down this rabbit hole. I guess this is testament to the fact that we're all worn down by the idea of kind of surveillance and stuff, that we're not actually talking about digital ID systems here anymore. We've kind of accepted that this is probably going to come even with that consultation, even if it said that we don't like it. And we're now just moving on to talking about the definition of purdah.
Well, here's what you want from a technology podcast. Open bracket about everything else, close bracket. Purdah comes from Persian, Hindi, Urdu, parda, meaning curtain or veil. So in English, it came to mean the seclusion of women from the sight of men or strangers, particularly in some Hindu and Muslim communities. So it became political shorthand because the pre-election period is around seclusion. So ministers and civil servants going quiet, but it is primarily around the seclusion of women. So it is built in a sexist term, which I definitely should have known about. And I think in the back of my mind, I have heard that before, so I should have known about that. But if you're not unnecessarily close to Westminster.
Okay, I will check my privileges and I will not use purdah anymore. That's actually really interesting. I hadn't had any idea of where it comes from. English is an amazing language, right? I mean, we have all these borrowed words that we just use that are like
Borrowed is such a beautiful empire word of empire of
borrow.
stole.
Just
We
borrow
stole,
this. No, I'll just borrow
stole
this.
against others' will.
Borrow this on a long-term loan with no fixed date for return. That is
Are we going to give
the
it back?
British way.
Nobody asked. When someone asks, are we give it back? No. The James
probably not.
Acaster bit around the British Museum is a beautifully succinct, very clever bit of comedy around the theft of things that are not ours.
Right. So talking about the theft of things that are not ours, one thing that definitely is ours is our ID, and I am slightly concerned.
Great segue back
Thank
into
you.
actual
Just
stuff we're meant to be
locked
talking about.
in. I was immediately locked in.
See what happens when I don't have enough time to do research. See what happens. See.
I have to try and drag us back to the reality, and that's always incredibly difficult because I'm usually the one that drags us away from it. Maybe I trust that actually some future pick your party government will not leave this in the back of a taxi somewhere on a USB stick. And I think that is the worry that I have, particularly as we enter into a post-Mythos, post-GPT 5.4 cyber world where you're effectively like a lame duck waiting to be shot at by hackers. Do I want to have that one point of failure which has all of my information from my name to my age, to my arrest record, to my GCSE results, to the prescriptions that I get from my GP, all neatly packaged? Not really. If you're asking me in terms of convenience, yes. If you're asking me in terms of worst case scenarios, and increasingly I think we have to face those worst case scenarios and assume that actually they may come true one day, that's where it gets a little bit icky for me. And that's where I'm a bit like, do I want that digital ID? Not really, but I'm aware that that almost makes me sound a little bit like talking about sovereignty, makes me sound like someone who's talking about their sovereign citizen rights and gumming up a court case or something like that.
So I'm a huge believer in self-sovereign identity. I think the principle behind it, in the same way, Tim Berners-Lee's version of the web is not the actual web. The mechanics and the philosophy behind it is not the reality. But the principle of self-sovereign identity, where you own your identity across every digital IRL format, and you own everything about you. That's a sort of extension of what GDPR was meant to be, and how that's actually worked out in practice is very different. And having that across digital and across real life is a really, really powerful thing, given that most people live across many different spheres. The reality is that you would have to trust not just one government, you would have to trust a number of governments across different countries. If there's a single point of failure across so many different things, could end up either leaking your data or misusing your data, or building a picture either on gender, race profile, demographic, any of those things. And because if that information is allowed out and is allowed state monitoring, what are the safeguards in place? And are you relying on the goodwill of government? And particularly in recent times, relying on the goodwill of governments is not necessarily the sharpest thing you could possibly do.
Yeah, and there's this element of, if you're asking me, do I trust government digital services to correctly sandbox all of this stuff? Yeah, I probably do, actually. And I think that would be an incredibly difficult but also incredibly exciting task to try and identify how on earth you make sure that the bouncer at the nightclub only has your age, while the airline has your arrest history, while the police has your phone number, your car registration, your address, and all of these different things combining into one. But then do I trust the actual politicians to go out and be good custodians of that, to not try and link some of those data elements together, to break down those walls that some poor IT person has spent ages trying to set up? Not really. And also, given the direction of travel politically, not really sure that I trust future governments to do that. And that is the reality. We have to bear in mind these things have more permanence than perhaps we might first think.
That's the point that we're talking about in the interview, is actually legislation isn't like the cart before the horse. We're so far behind on this. And if that's the case, even for something I'm going to say simple for short, and it's incredibly complicated, but the simple thing of should your face be allowed to be run through databases and recognized without necessarily a warrant? And that is happening, even though it's a significant change in privacy and rights of freedom. But if that's for the simple thing, the complicated thing of what the law says around if and how your digital ID can be used by the state, by tax authorities, by international governments, by the police is infinitely more complicated, and so it could take decades before, even if digital cards come in, before the law catches up to exactly where it needs to be around what isn't allowed by statute.
And what happens in that interregnum? What happens before you get that, I think, is where things get really incredibly messy. We have precedent of that in the US with Doge, kind of combining bits of data and then turning out that some of that was exfiltrated by just one worker and used elsewhere.
We're not going to get into Doge. We're not going to get into, but I don't think anyone is looking to repeat that. No, not saying that. Right, we'll be back. We're going to finish there. I'll be back in 1 minute. Welcome back to the final part of Crashed. This is the section to which there are questions to which there are no answers for, and that the exact wording of that changes every week because I keep pronouncing it wrong. So, Chris, do you want to go first or shall I go first?
You go first.
How long after the voluntary digital IDs come in, will they no longer be voluntary?
Gosh, I mean, the obvious answer is not long at all, right? These, I mean, this is the slippery slope argument that people like Liberty are making against why we need to fight for this sort of stuff, why it's important that we say, actually, it's not okay what's happening, the creeping, guess what they might see as authoritarianism, the ability to kind of match this stuff up, regardless of things that are concerning, even if it's nothing else. To me, like there's a difference also between mandatory and like de facto mandatory. So in the sense of not that you absolutely have to do it, but that you become the odd one for not doing it. And I think that's something that we've seen through the use of social media, right? I mean, there are people who consciously opt out of doing this sort of stuff, of signing up to all the social media platforms, of engaging there. And you often think of them as slightly unusual for that. Even when we were talking to Mark there, the fact that he's not on all the social media networks that you would imagine, the fact that he's only on LinkedIn kind of makes you sit up and go, oh, like that's strange.
I think less so now. I think actually, as you're looking at all the Gen Z bit, and again, like all reports in the media are greatly exaggerated, but if you look at the Gen Z IRL switch off, the lack of social media, the end of doom scrolling, all of those things, it feels like actually those people that never really joined or only joined for very specific circumstances are being shown to be almost soothsayer-like in their being ability to predict the future, and more people are coming off social because they, rightly or wrongly, as we've talked about on Crash, see it as damaging to their mental health profoundly.
But they have their own issues, right? We talked about the idea that they feel a little bit more comfortable perhaps with facial recognition and things like that. Everyone has their own burden, and I think that to try and stand out in a particularly younger generation, say, actually, I don't think that's acceptable, I don't want to hand that over, it's a kind of powerful tool. So I imagine that you have the same sort of approach towards digital IDs, where it's not that you have to, but it's just that it becomes either more hassle not to, or you get seen as being a rabble rouser or a troublemaker for choosing not to. Anyway, I have a question for you, which is hopefully equally thorny for you to answer, because thank you so much for that. What is the highest stakes job that you would be happy having a chatbot pose as?
None. Not a single job yet.
None.
Not
even podcast co-host.
I feel like in an early episode we tried that, and it was outed
awful,
how garbage it was. It was just horrible back in the early days before we knew how to podcast. Arguably, that's still now.
Still now, very much still now. But
very much still now. We're learning as we go. So I was having a chat this morning at a breakfast hosted by MongoDB, who are like a database company. Good segue. I haven't had an email back about whether or not I'm allowed to break their embargo that happens just after this. So I won't break their embargo. But very lovely breakfast, had a lovely time. I think we might be getting someone from them on in a few weeks. And they were very much talking about this agentic layer of already working to really replace services and layers, but not people. My questions to them were very much about, do I trust the bot to make a decision? No. I will trust a bot to do the work, and I will trust a bot to manufacture around some things, but I won't trust a bot to make a decision yet. I think it comes to our fundamental disconnect between where you think and I think. So you see the potential in these sorts of things, and you see that they kind of work if you know what you're doing. And I see that these things absolutely in time, because of the early adopters like you, will change everything. They will take over, and they will automate so many processes. But my fundamental thing is they don't work yet.
Well, it's interesting that that's your limit is customer service advisor, because there's a case at the minute being heard in court in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, not the state, although I don't quite understand the difference, where character AI, which already has some issues around things like this, they've been taken to court by the governor of the state, basically saying that users can interact with a chatbot that suggests that it's a doctor, but obviously clearly is not actually a doctor. Now, character AI say that they can't comment on pending legislation. They say that it's made very clear that this is a chatbot and it is playing a role. But I think it gets to that point of like, how much are we willing to integrate these into our lives? Like, or is it that there is a point at which you would be comfortable with this sort of thing?
It's that beta testing in public thing again. It's that, because for it to work, it has to have enough, whether it be a small language model in specific chatbot cases or a large language model, whatever that is. It has to beta test because it has to learn how customers interact with them. It has to make mistakes. It has to be irritating and pointless, and it has to feed back all of that data so it improves. So it has to do that in public. That's part of its operating model. That's part of how it has to work. But if you are talking about doctors and if you're talking about real medical advice, I think there is that don't blame the victim. It's often really quite desperate people looking for really difficult things they don't either they have the money for, or depending on the state, they have the confidence to attend a medical professional for, but also building more intense critical thinking into curriculums across the board, whereby like this, I believe this news, like, oh, look at those was it rabbits on the trampoline, wherever that was, any baby looking happy, or any animal having a silly time is now probably a deep fake. And yet having that discerning eye across what can be trusted and what can't, like, should you use another them to ask advice for? Yes, but you should then fact check it and work through it. Should you just believe what it says? As the second you switch the voice mode on, people start believing it because they sound friendlier. What job are you replacing a chatbot with? Right? This not what will you? Because I agree that like so much of that customer service, customer facing stuff will go, but this very second, what you're replacing it with?
I was listening to discussions today on the radio about the kind of fears that new grads have about the job market, again prompted by just yet another story of doom and gloom and things like that. It feels like we're at that very difficult inflection point where these things are going to be part of our lives. They are inevitable, and we have to kind of work out the kinks. So I'm more concerned that you think that AI videos of babies are not fun things, even if they're not real. I still get joy from them because they are human-like and they remind me of quirky, silly things.
No, the magic of them is in their truth, and is in their innocence, is in their brilliance, is in the power of the world being a silly place. And if you're fictionalizing the world being a silly place, then it's just this, anything is possible, time machines are invented, everything is great, the society is perfect. The beauty and the whole reason they're being watched is because they happen, because they're true.
But that's why you listen to Crashed, because we are the podcast about everything else, and we start on one thing, tackle the serious issues, and also give you the AI baby equivalent of podcasts into your ears.
And to show how great AI is, my document with my end of this thing on it has just popped up as a notification saying, you often open at around exactly this time. It knows too much. Crashed is an Everything Popular is Wrong production. Follow us on all your favourite podcast platforms. Title music is from Nuffer. Check them out on all the streamers. We're hosted by Acast, assisted by Riverside Studios. We're published every Thursday morning. You can find me at Alex Huds across everywhere. Follow Chris at Stokel on X. All these links are there. Go to crash.substack.com. Email us alex@crash.org.uk or chris@crash.org.uk. Search for Chris Podcast on Substack or wherever the hell you want. We'll be back next week.